That boy has been lurking around the playground for 20 minutes, the woman said loudly into her phone, pointing directly at my grandson while half the park turned to stare at him. Malik froze beside the duck pond, his small camera still hanging around his neck, and for one terrible second, I saw confusion replace the bright excitement that had filled his face all afternoon. It was a warm Saturday in late June, the kind of Chicago afternoon where families crowded the park with picnic blankets, strollers, and folding lawn chairs while children chased each other across the grass beneath a cloudless blue sky. Just 10 minutes earlier, Malik had been laughing while trying to film a red-winged blackbird for his summer science project. He'd spent the entire week researching migratory birds at the public library, carefully writing notes in the little spiral notebook he carried everywhere now that summer break had started. At 11 years old, he was the kind of child who said, "Yes, ma'am," without being asked and thanked cashiers at grocery stores. But none of that seemed to matter once the woman in the white tennis skirt raised her voice. "I'm serious," she continued into the phone. "He keeps watching the kids." My chest tightened so fast it felt like someone had pulled a rope around my ribs. I stood up slowly from the park bench beside the walking trail, gripping the paper cup of lemonade in my hand so tightly the lid bent inward. Malik turned toward me, his dark brown eyes wide beneath the brim of his Cubs baseball cap. "Grandma?" he asked quietly. I could already feel the atmosphere changing around us. Parents who had been chatting comfortably moments ago suddenly looked alert. One father reached for his daughter's hand and guided her toward the swings without saying a word. A woman pushing a stroller slowed down just enough to glance at Malik before quickly looking away again. And standing near the sandbox with one manicured hand pressed dramatically against her chest was the woman who had started all of it. She looked to be in her early 40s, blonde hair pulled into a perfect ponytail, oversized sunglasses resting on top of her head, even though there wasn't a cloud in sight. Everything about her looked polished and expensive, from her spotless white sneakers to the giant diamond ring flashing on her finger as she pointed again in Malik's direction. "Yes," she said into the phone. "I think someone should come check things out." Malik lowered his camera slowly. "I was just filming birds," he whispered. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and hearing that nearly broke me. Because I knew that tone. I had heard it before, decades ago, in my younger brother's voice back in Birmingham when a store owner accused him of stealing a candy bar he had already paid for. Some memories never really leave your body. They just wait quietly beneath the surface until something drags them back into the light. I walked toward Malik carefully, refusing to rush no matter how badly my pulse pounded inside my ears. "Stay beside me, baby," I said softly. Across the park, I could already hear the distant sound of sirens growing louder. And the woman in white smiled like she had just done something noble. The police cruiser rolled slowly along the curb beside the park entrance before stopping near the basketball court, and the entire atmosphere shifted the moment two officers stepped out into the afternoon sunlight. Conversations lowered. Children stopped running. Even the laughter near the picnic tables seemed to disappear into the heavy summer air. Malik moved closer beside me until his shoulder lightly touched my arm, and I could feel how tense he had suddenly become. Just minutes ago, he had been excitedly telling me about camera angles and bird migration patterns. Now he stood perfectly still, clutching the strap of his backpack with both hands like he was afraid to move the wrong way. The taller officer adjusted his utility belt as he approached us, while the second officer stayed slightly behind him, scanning the area calmly. I noticed several people watching openly now, pretending not to stare, while still listening closely enough to catch every word. The woman in white walked forward immediately before either officer could even speak to us. "That is him," she announced confidently, pointing toward Malik again. "I saw him hanging around the playground recording children." Her voice carried across the walking trail just loud enough for nearby parents to hear. Malik lowered his eyes toward the pavement. "I was filming birds for school," he said softly. The taller officer looked down at him for a moment before glancing at the camera around his neck. "What is your name, son?" he asked. "Malik Brooks," he answered politely. "And this is my grandmother." I stepped forward slightly. "My name is Gloria Brooks," I said carefully. "We have been here for about an hour working on his science project." The woman let out a short laugh under her breath, the kind designed to sound dismissive without sounding openly rude. "Well, that is not what it looked like to me," she replied quickly. "He kept standing near the playground with that camera. I looked toward the playground, then back toward the duck pond, less than 30 feet away. Malik had never once stepped near the children's area. He had spent almost the entire afternoon near the water, trying to capture footage of birds landing along the edge of the pond. But facts suddenly seemed less important than perception. And perception had already turned against us the second she made that phone call. I noticed a little girl tugging on her mother's sleeve nearby, while whispering something into her ear. The mother nodded quietly without taking her eyes off Malik. That hurt more than I expected. Not because strangers were watching us, but because my grandson could feel it happening in real time. I could see it in the way his shoulders had tightened and the way he avoided looking directly at anyone now. Officer Reyes, whose name I noticed stitched onto his uniform, kept his voice calm. "Can I see the footage on the camera, Malik?" Malik nodded immediately and carefully removed the camera strap from around his neck before handing it over with both hands. His fingers were trembling slightly. "I only filmed birds," he repeated quietly. "And the pond." Officer Reyes scrolled through the footage while silence spread across the small crowd gathering near the walking trail. Ducks floated across the water. Trees swayed in the wind. A squirrel climbed halfway up a trash can searching for food. Every clip looked exactly like what an 11-year-old child would record for a science assignment. Nothing more. Nothing suspicious. Just a boy enjoying a Saturday afternoon in the park. But the woman crossed her arms anyway. "You can never be too careful these days," she said loudly enough for everyone around us to hear. And the frightening thing was how many people nodded like that sentence alone explained everything. Officer Reyes continued scrolling through the camera footage with the kind of patience that made the silence around us feel even heavier. Every few seconds, another short video played across the small screen. Birds gliding across the pond. Ripples spreading through the water after a duck landed. Sunlight moving through tree branches overhead. Nothing about it looked unusual. Nothing about Malik looked dangerous. But the woman in white refused to let the moment settle naturally. "Predators do not exactly announce themselves," she said with a shrug, glancing around as though expecting support from the crowd gathering near the trail. "People need to trust their instincts." I noticed two women near the picnic area exchange uncomfortable looks before quietly stepping farther away. One man folded his arms tightly across his chest while staring at Malik with narrowed eyes, almost as if he was trying to convince himself there had to be something suspicious hidden somewhere inside the situation. Fear has a strange way of making people want evidence after they have already decided what they believe. Malik stood perfectly still beside me, his backpack hanging from one shoulder now. I could hear the soft clicking sound from the basketball court nearby, where someone continued shooting alone, completely disconnected from the tension spreading through the park. Everything else felt frozen. "Did you approach any children today?" Officer Reyes asked calmly. Malik shook his head immediately. "No, sir," he answered. "I stayed by the pond because that is where the birds were." "Did you speak to anyone near the playground?" "No, sir." The woman interrupted before the officer could respond. "He was watching them," she insisted quickly. "I saw him standing there several times." Officer Reyes looked up at her. "Ma'am, the footage places him near the pond for most of the afternoon." "Well, maybe he stopped once he noticed people paying attention," she replied sharply. The explanation came too fast, changing shape the moment the facts stopped supporting her version of events. I saw Officer Reyes notice it too. His expression remained polite, but his eyes lingered on her a little longer this time. Beside me, Malik swallowed hard before speaking again. "I was trying to record the red-winged blackbirds because my teacher said they migrate through Illinois during summer." His voice sounded small now, careful in a way no child should have to sound during a Saturday trip to the park. "I needed at least 3 minutes of footage for my science presentation." Officer Reyes nodded slowly. "What school do you go to?" "Lincoln Middle School." "And who assigned the project?" "Mrs. Patterson." The answers came instantly because they were true. Honest children rarely need time to remember details. The woman in white shifted her weight impatiently. "You cannot seriously be treating this like a school assignment," she muttered. "People should be thanking me for saying something before it was too late." I looked at her then. Really looked at her for the first time since all this began. There was no fear in her face now. No concern. No panic. Just irritation that reality was no longer cooperating with the story she wanted everyone else to believe. And somehow that hurt even more. Because Malik had not frightened her. He had offended her simply by existing in a space where she thought suspicion belonged more naturally to him than innocence. A soft breeze moved across the pond behind us, carrying the smell of sunscreen, grass, and lake water through the warm afternoon air. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed again for the first time in several minutes. But the sound felt fragile now. Like the park itself was waiting to see who people would believe once all the noise finally settled. The crowd around the walking trail had grown larger without anyone openly admitting they were watching. That was the strange thing. About moments like this, people always pretended they just happened to be nearby, even while leaning slightly closer to hear every word. A teenage boy stopped bouncing his basketball near the court. A woman carrying iced coffee slowed beside the bike rack. Parents kept their children near them now, not because of anything Malik had done, but because one confident accusation had changed the emotional temperature of the entire park. Officer Reyes handed the camera back carefully. Everything on here appears consistent with what Malik described, he said evenly. Bird footage, pond footage, nature shots. The woman in white pressed her lips together tightly before speaking again. Well, maybe he deleted things before you arrived, she replied. Kids know technology these days. I felt Malik tense beside me. He lowered his eyes toward the grass again, and something about that small movement hurt me more than the accusation itself. Children should not learn shame this early, especially not the kind that arrives before they even understand why they are being judged. I rested my hand gently against the middle of his back. Through his thin gray t-shirt, I could feel how stiff his posture had become. He was trying so hard to stay calm, trying so hard to sound respectful, trying so hard not to look afraid. And suddenly, I was no longer standing in a Chicago park in 2026. For one painful moment, I was 14 years old again in Birmingham, Alabama, watching my older brother Marcus get followed through a department store by a security guard who never once accused him directly of anything. Marcus had kept his hands visible the entire time while pretending not to notice. Later that night, after we got home, I asked him why he did not say something. He looked at me quietly while loosening his tie in the hallway mirror and said, "Sometimes surviving the moment safely matters more than winning the argument." I had hated those words when I was young. They sounded too tired, too accepting. But standing beside my grandson now, I finally understood how exhaustion could become a language all its own. Malik shifted slightly beside me before speaking in a near whisper. "Grandma," he said carefully, "did I do something wrong?" The question landed softly, but it cut through me sharper than anything else that afternoon. Around us, several people looked away immediately after hearing it. One woman near the picnic tables lowered her head toward her phone like she suddenly needed to check a message that could not possibly wait. Even Officer Reyes seemed to pause for half a second before answering. "No," I said before anyone else could speak. My voice remained calm, but I tightened my hand against Malik's shoulder. "You did absolutely nothing wrong." The woman in white crossed her arms again, clearly frustrated that the situation was no longer unfolding the way she expected. "I was only trying to protect children," she insisted loudly. People act like being cautious is some kind of crime now. But there was something rehearsed about the way she kept repeating herself, like she needed the crowd to keep validating her fear before she could continue believing it herself. Officer Reyes glanced toward her again. "Ma'am," he said politely, "at this point we have not found any evidence of suspicious behavior." Her expression changed slightly then. Not embarrassment, not relief, annoyance, as though reality itself had become inconvenient. A breeze swept across the pond once more, rustling leaves overhead, while sunlight shimmered across the water behind us. Malik looked down at the camera resting in his hands again, and I realized with sudden sadness that he had stopped seeing it as something fun. Now it was evidence. Proof. A tool he needed to defend his innocence instead of simply enjoy his childhood. Officer Reyes stepped a few feet away from us and spoke quietly into the radio attached to his shoulder, while the second officer remained near the walking trail, calmly observing the growing crowd around the pond. The atmosphere had changed again, though this time it felt less certain. People no longer looked at Malik with immediate suspicion. Now they looked confused, uncomfortable, as if they were beginning to realize they had accepted a frightening narrative far too quickly simply because someone confident enough had delivered it first. The woman in white seemed to sense the shift too. She adjusted the expensive leather purse hanging from her shoulder and glanced around more frequently now, searching for reassurance in the faces surrounding her. But the nods had mostly stopped. The murmurs sounded different too. Quieter. Less supportive. Malik stood beside me silently, tracing his thumb along the edge of his camera strap while staring toward the pond. He looked smaller somehow than he had an hour earlier, even though the warm sunlight still stretched across the grass exactly the same way. Childhood can shrink quickly in moments like these. "You okay, baby?" I asked softly. He nodded automatically before asking something that made my stomach ache. "Do you think she would have called if I looked different?" For a second, I could not answer him. Because children know more than adults like to pretend they do. They notice hesitation, tone, fear, distance. They notice the way suspicion settles onto certain people faster than others. And once they see it clearly for the first time, they never completely unsee it again. I inhaled slowly through my nose before speaking. Some people see danger where there is none because fear makes them stop seeing people clearly, I said quietly. Malik looked down at the grass again. But I was just filming birds. "I know," I answered. "And that matters." Nearby, Officer Reyes returned from the edge of the walking trail with a thoughtful expression I had not seen earlier. He approached the woman in white directly this time instead of us. "Ma'am," he said evenly. "You mentioned earlier that the boy had been approaching children near the playground." "Yes," she replied immediately. "Several times. Can you point out where exactly this happened?" She hesitated for the first time all afternoon. "Only a second or two, but long enough." "Near the swings," she answered finally. Officer Reyes glanced toward the playground before looking back at her. "That is interesting," he said calmly. "Because park security cameras show him remaining near the pond area during the time frame you described." Silence settled heavily between them. The woman blinked twice behind her sunglasses before quickly. "Recovering." "Well, maybe I mixed up where I first saw him," she replied sharply. "I was focused on protecting the children." The explanation sounded thinner now, less confident, like fabric beginning to tear under pressure. A few feet away, a teenage girl sitting on the edge of the fountain suddenly lowered her phone from where she had quietly been recording part of the situation. "Actually," she said carefully, speaking for the first time, "I think I have video from earlier." Every head turned toward her. She looked nervous immediately after speaking, but continued anyway. "I was filming a dance clip for TikTok near the fountain about 30 minutes ago," she explained. "And I think that woman was the one following the boy around before the police got here." The entire mood of the park shifted so suddenly it almost felt physical. The woman in white straightened immediately. "That is ridiculous," she snapped. But for the first time since this began, her voice no longer sounded completely certain. The teenage girl stood slowly from the edge of the fountain, gripping her phone with both hands now that everyone in the park was looking at her. She could not have been older than 16. Her curly brown hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, and her cheeks turned pink almost immediately under the sudden attention. "I did not mean to record any of this," she explained nervously. "I was just filming dance clips with my cousin earlier." Officer Reyes nodded reassuringly. "It is okay," he said calmly. "Can you show me what you recorded?" The girl stepped closer and unlocked her phone while the crowd instinctively tightened inward around the scene. Even the woman in white remained frozen beside the walking trail now, though her posture had changed completely. Earlier she had stood tall, almost proud of herself. Now her shoulders looked rigid beneath the expensive cream sweater wrapped around them, despite the warm weather. Officer Reyes watched the screen carefully as the girl played the video. At first, it looked ordinary. Music from the fountain area. Teenagers laughing. People walking dogs through the park. But then the camera angle shifted slightly during the recording. And there she was, the woman in white. Clear as day, not watching the playground. Watching Malik. Following him from a distance near the pond while he adjusted the settings on his camera. In the video, Malik never approached a single child. Never spoke to anyone. He simply moved along the waterline, trying to capture footage of birds landing near the reeds. But the woman continued trailing him from several yards away, staring at him repeatedly before eventually pulling out her phone. The silence surrounding us deepened with every passing second of footage. Someone near the bike rack muttered, "Oh wow," under their breath. Another parent slowly lowered the hand they had been resting protectively on their child's shoulder. Officer Reyes replayed part of the clip again without speaking. This time everyone could see it clearly. The timeline no longer matched the story she had confidently repeated over and over all afternoon. The woman swallowed visibly before forcing out a nervous laugh. "That does not prove anything," she said quickly. I was monitoring the situation because something felt off, but the confidence in her voice had cracked now. Tiny pieces of panic had started slipping through. The teenage girl frowned slightly. You followed him for almost 10 minutes, she replied quietly. I remember noticing because he looked like he was just filming birds. Malik stared at the ground while gripping his camera tightly against his chest. He still had not said a single angry word through any of this. That somehow made the entire scene even harder to watch. Officer Reyes finally looked directly at the woman again. Ma'am, he said carefully, at this point the evidence we have reviewed does not support your claims. A long pause followed. The woman glanced around at the crowd surrounding her now, but the energy had completely changed. Earlier people had looked toward Malik with suspicion. Now they looked at her with discomfort instead. Not dramatic outrage. Not yelling. Just disappointment settling slowly across dozens of faces at once. The kind of silence that feels heavier than shouting. A man near the basketball court shook his head quietly before walking away. Hey. Mother near the picnic tables bent down and whispered something softly to her daughter while avoiding eye contact with the woman entirely. The social protection she had expected from the crowd was disappearing inch by inch. And for the first time all afternoon, she looked truly alone. Malik finally lifted his eyes slightly toward me. Grandma, he whispered carefully. Why was she following me? I looked at his face, still trying so hard to understand cruelty through the logic of an 11-year-old mind. And I realized there are some questions children should never have to ask in the first place. The woman in white opened her mouth several times like she wanted to say something strong enough to regain control of the moment, but every sentence seemed to fall apart before it fully formed. The park no longer belonged to her version of the story. That was obvious now. People who had quietly stood behind her earlier had begun drifting away from her side of the walking trail altogether, creating a strange, empty space around her without anyone directly acknowledging it. It happened gradually. A father picked up his folding chair and moved closer to the basketball court. A couple near the fountain suddenly became deeply interested in packing their cooler. Even the woman with the stroller who had avoided eye contact with us earlier now looked openly uncomfortable whenever she glanced toward Malik. Shame moves through crowds faster than people realize, especially once certainty disappears. Officer Reyes handed the phone back to the teenage girl and thanked her quietly before turning his attention back toward the woman. At this point, he said evenly, there is no evidence this child posed any threat to anyone in the park. The word child seemed to land heavily in the afternoon air, because that was exactly what Malik was. Not suspicious, not dangerous, not a problem to monitor. Just an 11-year-old boy carrying a camera near a duck pond on a warm Saturday afternoon. The woman crossed her arms tighter against herself. I was trying to be responsible, she muttered, though her voice had lost nearly all the confidence it carried earlier. People always complain that. Nobody says anything until something bad happens. Officer Reyes nodded slightly, but his expression remained careful. There is a difference between being cautious and making assumptions without evidence. The sentence was calm, professional, but the meaning behind it settled visibly across the crowd around us. A silence followed that felt different from the earlier tension. This silence carried recognition, the kind that forces people to replay their own reactions inside their heads. I watched several faces around the park soften when they looked toward Malik now. A middle-aged man near the fountain gave him a small apologetic nod before looking away. A woman holding a toddler whispered something quietly to her husband while glancing toward us with obvious regret. Nobody wanted to admit how quickly fear had rewritten an innocent scene in their minds. Malik shifted beside me and adjusted the brim of his baseball cap lower over his eyes. Can we just go home now? He asked softly. Hearing that hurt more than I expected. Earlier that morning he had begged me to stay at the park long enough to capture better footage near sunset, because he loved the way the birds skimmed across the water during golden hour. Now all he wanted was to leave. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because an entire public space had briefly turned him into something suspicious. The woman suddenly noticed several phones pointed in her direction now. Not aggressively, just quietly recording, capturing the aftermath the same way people always do once they realize history might judge a moment differently later. Her face flushed deep red beneath her makeup. This is unbelievable, she snapped, glancing around nervously. People are acting like I committed some terrible crime. Nobody answered her. That silence said more than words could have. Because deep down, everyone standing there understood the real damage had never been about the police arriving. It was about a child learning how fragile innocence could become once fear attached itself to the color of his skin. Officer Reyes finally stepped back slightly and addressed Malik directly. "You are free to enjoy the rest of your afternoon, okay?" Malik nodded politely out of habit, though he still kept his eyes lowered toward the ground. Then Officer Reyes looked toward me briefly, and something in his expression shifted from official professionalism to quiet understanding. Not pity. Something older than that. The kind of understanding that comes from recognizing a wound society keeps reopening generation after generation while pretending each incident is somehow isolated. The crowd around the pond slowly began breaking apart after Officer Reyes finished speaking, but the emotional weight of the afternoon still lingered heavily in the warm air. Conversations returned in fragments. Children drifted cautiously back toward the playground. Somewhere near the basketball court, a radio started playing music again at low volume. The park was trying to return to normal, but nothing about the afternoon felt normal anymore. Malik stood beside me quietly, staring at the water while absent-mindedly rubbing the corner of his science notebook between his fingers. He had not asked to keep filming. He had not pointed out birds excitedly for several minutes now. That silence alone told me how deeply the moment had settled into him. Nearby, the woman in white remained frozen near the walking trail, while several people continued glancing toward her with obvious discomfort. Earlier, she had looked completely certain the crowd would support her. Now she looked like someone stranded in the middle of a conversation that had suddenly turned against her without warning. One of the parents near the picnic tables suddenly frowned while looking more carefully at her face. "Wait," the woman said slowly to her husband. "Is that Heather Collins?" Another parent nearby looked up immediately. "The HOA board member from Lakeview Estates?" he asked quietly. Heather's expression changed instantly. Panic flickered across her face so fast she could not hide it in time. The man near the fountain pulled out his phone and glanced between the screen and Heather again. "Oh wow," he muttered under his breath. Someone already posted the video. The teenage girl who had shared her recording lowered her phone awkwardly. "I think people started uploading clips while the police were still here," she admitted softly. Heather looked around sharply after hearing that. "Excuse me," she snapped. "People cannot just film me without permission." But even her anger sounded unstable now. Too late. Too defensive. Several people avoided eye contact with her completely, while others quietly walked farther away. Nobody argued. Nobody shouted. That almost made it worse. Public humiliation does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes through silence, through distance, through realizing the social approval you expected has vanished right in front of you. Officer Reyes remained calm. "Ma'am, this is a public park," he explained evenly. "People are legally allowed to record in public spaces." Heather tightened her grip around the strap of her purse so hard her knuckles turned pale. "This is insane," she whispered, though she sounded more frightened now than angry. A few feet away, a father bent down beside his young son and said quietly, "See, this is why we do not judge people without facts." I noticed Heather hear that sentence too. Her eyes shifted downward immediately afterward. Malik looked up at me carefully. "Are people mad at her now?" he asked in a small voice. I thought about the question before answering. "I think people are realizing they should have paid more attention before assuming the worst about someone," I said softly. Malik nodded slowly, though sadness still lingered across his face in a way no child should carry after a summer afternoon at the park. Across the walking trail, Heather suddenly pulled her sunglasses down over her eyes even though the sunlight had already begun softening toward evening. Then, without another word, she turned and started walking quickly toward the parking lot. Nobody stopped her. Nobody followed her. But several phones quietly tracked her movement as she left. The same public attention she had tried directing toward my grandson had now circled back around her completely. I watched her disappear past the line of parked cars while the breeze carried the smell of fresh-cut grass across the pond again. And standing there beside Malik, I realized something. Painful. The worst part of the afternoon was not that strangers had believed the accusation so quickly. It was that my grandson had witnessed exactly how fragile innocence could become once fear and bias entered the room together. The park slowly settled back into motion after Heather disappeared toward the parking lot, but the afternoon sunlight felt different now. Softer somehow. Quieter. The crowd that had gathered near the pond dissolved piece by piece until only scattered families remained along the walking trail and playground. A little girl chased Bubbles near the fountain, while someone grilled hot dogs beside the picnic shelter farther down the hill. Life continued the way it always does after uncomfortable moments finally pass. But for Malik and me, something invisible had shifted permanently beneath the surface of the day. Officer Reyes approached us one last time before leaving. His voice remained calm, though there was a heaviness behind it now that had not been there earlier. "I am sorry this happened to you both," he said quietly. "You handled yourselves with a lot of grace today." I nodded politely. "Thank you for listening before making assumptions," I replied. He glanced briefly toward Malik, who still held the camera close against his chest. "Do not stop filming birds, okay?" he told him gently. "The world needs more kids interested in things like that." For the first time in nearly an hour, the corners of Malik's mouth lifted slightly. Just a little, but enough. Officer Reyes tipped his head politely before walking back toward the patrol car with his partner. We watched the cruiser pull away slowly until it disappeared beyond the line of oak trees bordering the park entrance. Then silence settled between Malik and me again. Not uncomfortable silence, just tired silence. The kind that arrives after emotions have burned themselves down low. Malik stared out across the pond where golden evening light now stretched across the water like melted copper. A flock of birds skimmed low over the surface before lifting sharply into the air together. Earlier, he would have rushed to capture the moment on camera immediately. Now he simply watched them, quietly with his hands resting at his sides. "Grandma," he asked after a long pause, "how do you stay calm when people treat you like that?" I looked at him carefully before answering. At 11 years old, he was already asking questions many grown adults still struggle to answer honestly. I sat down slowly on the same park bench where our afternoon had begun hours earlier and motioned for him to sit beside me. The wood beneath us still felt warm from the sun. "Because people like that want fear," I said softly. "Fear makes them feel powerful. The moment you lose yourself trying to prove your humanity to someone determined not to see it, they win twice." Malik looked down at the camera in his hands again. "But it still hurts." "I know," I answered truthfully. "And it probably always will a little." The breeze moved gently through the trees overhead, while children laughed somewhere near the playground behind us. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life returning. I rested my hand over Malik's small fingers wrapped around the camera strap. "But listen to me carefully," I continued. "What happened today says everything about her and nothing about you. Never let somebody else's fear convince you to become smaller." Malik was quiet for several seconds before finally nodding. Then slowly, almost cautiously, he lifted the camera again and pointed it toward the pond. A bird landed near the waterline just as the evening sun dipped lower across the horizon. Malik adjusted the focus carefully this time, his movements steadier now. Click. The sound echoed softly between us. Small, ordinary, beautiful. And somehow that single photograph felt more important than anything else that had happened all afternoon.